Thanks for choosing this free Anfield Index podcast. If you'd prefer to listen to this or any of our other shows without adverts, then now's the time to check out Anfield Index Pro. With AI Pro, you can supercharge your entire listening experience. You'll not only get all of our podcasts without the ads, but you'll have them far faster with our quick publish feature available exclusively for subscribers. AI Pro also puts you in the heart of our sound studio, with an option to listen to many of our shows live and interact with the podcasters in real time as the shows are recording. Upgrading couldn't be easier. AI Pro is available on all popular podcast platforms, and we have our own apps for Apple and Android. Just head on over to AnfieldIndexPro.com and get started today.
Hello and welcome to Money Talks. I am your host, but I will introduce you to whose show it is, and that is Mo. How are you doing, Mo?
Yeah, really good. Very, very good. Glad the transfer window is over at last. Stop talking about that and getting into arguments and all sorts. Yeah. How about you?
I'm good. Eddie dropped this on my plate as soon as I woke up, so that's a good way of waking up. But you have thankfully helped me with what questions to ask and stuff like that, because I am a bit of an idiot when it comes to this stuff. But I'm here to host, not to give my opinion. But thankfully, you have sorted me out there, Mo.
Absolutely a pleasure. Yeah, lots of stuff to discuss.
Absolutely. But we are here to talk about the transfer window, and we obviously ended the window with a net spend of about 6 mil, if you factor in the loan fees. And you look at some of our rivals in the league, and they've spent, well, hundreds of millions. Nottingham Forest have spent basically £700 bazillion. And people, again, in the fan base are looking at FSG and whether it's too tight in it with the purse strings and stuff like that. What do you make of them accusations?
Yeah, so, right. I mean, at the start of the window, I put out a thread on Twitter, short thread by my standards, and also talked about it on Monday Talks to explain that, look, we had finished a season in which we would have generated a record amount of turnover revenue. We made it to the final of the Champions League, top 2 of the Premier League. Commercial revenue would have been its highest ever. We had the fans back in stadiums, so match day revenue would have been its highest ever, given that we played, I think, 30 games at home. I estimate we would have made around 580 million. It may well have been slightly more than that. But either way, turnover the likes of which Liverpool has never seen, and world football has hardly seen. There's very, very few clubs that have generated that amount of money. So on that basis, I was saying, look, we've not spent much over the last, since 2018, and we've generated all this money. And yes, we've got the Anfield Road End expansion underway, but we took out some borrowing to fund that, so that shouldn't impact on our ability to spend in the transfer window. We definitely shouldn't need to sell in order to buy. And so I was expecting us to spend significant amounts, and had it not been for one Kylian Mbappe ruining things by changing his mind about joining Real Madrid, then we would have spent the biggest amount of money in a transfer window since 2018, when we would have signed Tchouaméni from Monaco, some 3-4 months ago. That deal was very close to being done. He was committed to joining Liverpool until Real Madrid, who missed out on Kylian Mbappe, who changed his mind and decided to stay at PSG. Madrid then said, okay, well, we've got all this money to spend. Who can we spend it on? And they decided, of all players, to spend it on Tchouaméni, and splashed out a huge amount on the fee to Monaco, and also on the player as well. So, that was disappointing. And had that not happened, we would have had 2 marquee signings in the window, Tchouaméni and Núñez, with Carvalho also coming in alongside Ramsey. And, we all would have been very happy with that business. And, all of the arguments for the remainder of the summer would largely not have occurred. But nonetheless, that deal didn't go through, and we clearly didn't then turn to an alternative that Klopp was happy with and get that player over the line. We all know, it's not exactly a secret that, Jude Bellingham is also on our radar. And, despite efforts to perhaps get him in this summer, it was highly unlikely to happen. And, so it proved. So, we ended up spending less than we were expecting. And, fans then thought, oh, well, look, the amount we've spent is almost the same as the amount that we brought in from sales, the likes of Sadio Mane and others being moved on. So it means that it proves that FSG are tight and, we're carrying on selling to buy and, all this stuff. And I don't think that's fair. I think it's just a situation whereby, Jurgen Klopp was very specific about who he wanted. And when we couldn't bring those one or two or three players in, he wasn't really happy on other alternatives were, put forward in front of him. And so if there's anyone that you want to point the finger at, I would say it's Jurgen rather than the owners, as perhaps we'll talk about later. Jurgen made some interesting comments as well about that. So, there are perhaps two sides of the argument, but I don't think, in overall terms, it is fair to say on this occasion FSG were being tight because they were happy to sanction a very big, significant outlay on Chouameni at the start of the window. And this, by the way, was a deal that was very far advanced at exactly the same time as the Núñez one. So again, there was talk about, well, if we signed Chouameni, we wouldn't have signed Núñez. I completely disagree. All the evidence suggests that we were lining up both to come in at exactly the same time, pretty much, to join us at the start of pre-season, to have a full pre-season under Klopp, and then to start the season hitting the ground running, all being well. So it wasn't for me an either or. It was absolutely getting both in, getting the two youngsters in Ramsey and Carvalho, and feeling that we had a really, really good, strong group to go into the season and hopefully go on better than last season and win Champions League and or the Premier League.
Yeah, and Klopp himself said in the embargo, a bit of a press conference, we got rejected by a midfielder, so that was obviously Chouameni, wasn't it? So, yeah, I think the plan was clearly both. But you mentioned Jude Bellingham there, and he seemed to become the target when the Chouameni deal fell. Well, he changed his mind and went to Real Madrid after. Thank you, Mbappe, for that, by the way. Made the summer really fun. But we know the money it would have taken to get Jude out of Dortmund. It's probably above 100 mil or 120 million euro, I think I've seen at times. Now, do you think we had the money for that type of deal? Because I think Chouameni was about 50 to 60 mil, wasn't he? Whereas 120 mil would have been our biggest signing. I think it would have been the biggest for a British player or an English player. Now, how does that go into next summer? Because by all accounts, he'll be the target for next summer as well. And if his value goes up, because we know it's a World Cup year, and we know how the World Cup can spiral people's valuation, or skyrocket people's valuation, I should say. What do you make of that situation, and how much do you think we can earmark for that player?
Well, I mean, yeah, there was a lot of speculation that, Dortmund didn't want to sell two top players in the same window. Everyone in their cap knew that Haaland was on his way to Man City and had known that for, many months. So there was no surprises when that deal was announced. So after that, chances of prizing another key asset from Dortmund in the same window were highly unlikely, because that's generally how Dortmund don't operate, is to sell on more than one key asset at a time. And, ultimately, as the $1 million man Ted DiBiase once said, everyone has a price, and, Bellingham has a price as well. And I think that Liverpool's view was perhaps that, look, to spend that much amount of money on a 19-year-old at this stage just doesn't seem good value. And they felt that next summer would be a better time to do the deal. Now, is that for budgetary reasons? Possibly. We would have set a budget for deals this summer, and as you noted, we would have been expecting to spend 50 to 60 on Chouameni, whereas Jude would have cost pretty much double that. So, does that mean that we wouldn't have been able to afford it had that been possible this summer? I don't think so. I think we would still have been able to find a way. We would have had to stretch ourselves to make the deal happen. But clubs have many ways to make deals happen. And just as a very quick example of that, look at Nottingham Forest. As you noted earlier, that they signed that many players that you can hold 2 or 3 Royal Rumbles simultaneously. They probably don't even know half their names when they turn up to training on Monday. So, look, Nottingham Forest, where have they got all this money from? Very simple. They've borrowed money from funders, and they know that they'll be getting probably 130, 140 million out of the Premier League in TV money this year. Now, they won't get that money now. They'll get that through the season. So they would have borrowed money from funders, and they'll be able to repay that money as that money starts coming through from the Premier League. And then on top of that, obviously, they'll have other revenue streams such as match day revenue and other things. And also bear in mind, even though their transfer spend for this window might have been, 120, 130 million or whatever it was, that all isn't payable straight away. Most of those deals will be paid in instalments. So their actual outgoings for this year may have only had to be, for this summer may have only had to be, say, 40 million. And then the remainder will be paid over the next couple of years. So that is how a club like that would have made that deal happen. So in the same way, if we needed to find an extra 50 or 60 million for a club the size of Liverpool with its turnover being what it is, it wouldn't have been any problem whatsoever to borrow the money and then to repay it back. But clearly, the owners were prepared to do something like that. And it may well have come down to the fact that, to spend that kind of money would have taken us above the budget we had set. And so therefore the feeling was, let's wait till next year. And as you noted in the question, if Jude has a very good season even, has a strong World Cup, that valuation will surely increase. So my view is that part of the motivation behind waiting till next year, I feel that in the way that Haaland had a clause in his contract allowing him to go at a cut price deal in the summer of 2022, I feel that there's something similar in Jude Bellingham's contract for the summer of 23. Otherwise, there's every possibility that if he's worth 100 million now, he might be worth 120, 130, 140 or more next summer if he has another good, strong season. So I believe, that's me speculating, I believe that there's probably a clause in his contract, and we felt that we can't justify spending 100 to 120 now when he might be available for, 60, 70, 80 million next summer.
Yeah, absolutely.
That budget side as well. So, yeah, it's again one of those things, and we've seen it before where if Klopp feels there is a specific player they want, they will sometimes wait to get that player in.
Yeah, I'm going to go off script for a sec, but obviously if he goes to the open market like that, what is our spending? I suppose it's wage power rather than spending power, safe, because we've seen links to Real Madrid, and I'm sure the other English clubs will be involved. Would that just be the main concern there? Because we know our wage structure. Moore's on 350 with bonuses now, isn't he? I doubt we'd offer that to Jude, whereas Real Madrid and stuff like that probably would offer him that.
Yeah, I mean, there is certainly the risk that, not only Real Madrid, but even a Man City might come along and offer wages which will be well in excess of our wage structure. And, he'll only be 20 at the time, come summer 23. So, we typically don't offer 200,000 a week to a 19, 20-year-old. We would perhaps, even with a very significant transfer fee, still only start him on, I don't know, 120, 130, maybe 150 at most. But we do know that we do pay very significant bonuses. So when you factor those in, if he has a good season and Liverpool, has success, his effective weekly wage with bonuses factored in could be, 250 to 300,000 a week, which is still very, very good.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, I definitely wasn't earning that kind of money at that age and never will. So
still time, more, still time.
So yeah, for 20-year-old, that's pretty decent. A chunk of change to be earning on a weekly basis. But yeah, he is certainly somebody I think that will be of significant interest to other clubs. The only thing is, if you think back to 2017, taught that we really, really wanted Virgil van Dijk, and we weren't really interested in others. And at that point, he was the most sought after centre back probably in the world, and no other club really made a serious play for him. Even though there was speculation that I think it was the Daily Mail that put out an article that said, City had won the race for Van Dijk, only for it to be announced 2 or 3 days later that Liverpool had signed him. So, there will be some noise, and there will be certain credible sources that we can believe and other less credible sources that, we can easily ignore between now and next summer. But until there's a signature on the dotted line from the player himself, we certainly would be foolish to assume that he's ours. So, we're obviously all hoping that, he will come in, and if he does, he could be a very integral part to our future over the next decade or more. But yeah, I don't think other clubs will just take it lightly unless, he's let it be known that, there's only one club he's interested in no matter what they offer him. He doesn't care. He's only interested in Liverpool, in which case, he might then, there might be very little noise about City or Real Madrid wanting to put in, mega money offers to Dortmund and the player and his representatives. But yeah, let's wait and see what happens.
Yeah, it should be, well, hopefully for our sake it gets done, or maybe a pre-agreement or something later in the year. But we will see. I shall get back on script. I've overstepped my boundaries. A week and a half ago we saw Klopp, again in that embargoed section, take a slight dig seemingly at the owners, or maybe the higher ups such as Julian Ward. I'm guessing it's more at the owners in terms of the finances he kind of mentioned or hinted at. And he talked about he wanted to take a couple more risks, and I don't think he meant basically slagging off FSG, and he understands the model we work in. But what did you make of them comments? Because I know you've mentioned our model is very risk averse at times.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I mean, one of the things we know about Jurgen Klopp is he really doesn't come out and say anything that's critical in any way about the owners. He'll often praise them. He's not like a Rafa Benitez. He's not like an Antonio Conte that, with managers like that, if they feel that the owners are not spending enough and backing them enough in
or a Scott Parker.
Yeah, look how that turned out.
Right, well,
then they are not backwards in coming forwards with stuff like that. Whereas Klopp is the opposite. He's very much, if you want to use the phrase company man, he will always try and put on a united front. But he did kind of talk about, he feels that he would like the owners to quote unquote risk a bit more, and that was in relation to transfer activity. And I thought that was very interesting because reading between the lines, that said to me there was some frustration there. And, I think it was only a week before that, he talked about something very similar, which again seemed like a bit of a dig at the owners. Basically saying, look, I'm not in charge of making decisions about, how much we spend or don't spend. And, he normally doesn't say things like that. So at the same time, though, he made some contradictory comments as well, saying, look, everyone was right, I was wrong, we needed a midfielder. So reading between the lines for that, and also his most recent comments about wanting the owners to take a bit more of a risk, I feel that he was of the view Jude Bellingham was the player he wanted and nobody else after the Chouameni deal fell through. And he knew that there was a certain figure that would convince Dortmund to do away with, rather not do away, but sell Jude Bellingham this summer. And I think that Klopp hoped, maybe expected, that the owners would, on this occasion, spend that little bit more, perhaps pay over the odds to get the player in that Klopp wanted. And I think that alongside all of that, Klopp was saying, look, if I'm not going to get Jude, I don't want anyone else. Don't present any alternatives to me. So there's huge amounts of talk only, 3-4 weeks ago that, we could go for Matthias Nunes. And there was talk that, he was turning down offers from other clubs because he thought, Liverpool were coming in for him. He wanted to come to Liverpool. And, if you listen to more credible sources, they will tell you, look, it was actually Jurgen Klopp himself who turned down that deal when the player was ready to come. He was willing to come, almost desperate to come. And, that deal didn't happen. And reluctantly, he moved into Gag's neighbourhood and joined Wolverhampton Wanderers. And that was a shame. But then with Klopp's later comments about changing his mind, I think that suggested that, look, he'd finally admitted defeat on trying to get Jude Bellingham in this summer, and instead felt that, maybe it was right to finally accept that on this occasion an alternative may have to do, especially in light of the injury situation where, clearly nearly all of our midfielders are made of Pringles. So that was interesting, though, that, he came out with that. And I think the owners ultimately won because he didn't get his man. Jude Bellingham didn't join. We didn't go out and spend 100 million plus on the player. And, the owners held firm. And, that drew criticism. There were fans who said, well, look, Jurgen Klopp has delivered so much to these owners. He's won them all these trophies. He's helped play a massive part in increasing the value of Liverpool Football Club. If the owners wanted to sell that club, if you look at the valuation now compared to before he joined, he's easily added $1.5 billion to $2 billion dollars to the valuation of Liverpool Football Club. So surely the argument was they owe him, and maybe on this occasion they should go above and beyond to get the player for him. But clearly they didn't. And fans can make their mind up about whether Klopp deserved that backing or whether the owners were right to hold firm. So I'll let others make their minds up about that.
Yeah, it should be certainly interesting. See if Klopp maybe gets a bit more open now he's got his new contract. more power. But there is other halves to money spent in terms of transfer, because it's not just the transfer fee, there is the wage bill as well. You've obviously discussed this on this podcast, and you've obviously done your very detailed threads on Twitter as well. But this is often used as kind of, for want of a better word, an excuse by journos and maybe some mouthpieces for the club, that this is the growth of the wage bill in recent years. And obviously we mentioned the bonuses when we were talking about Jude. That may have spiralled out of control when excuse me, when we were winning stuff. But now we've kind of lost people like Mane and stuff like that. Where does the wage bill currently stand, and how has it affected the windows in the last few transfer windows?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think back to summer 2018, we brought in Allison, we brought in Naby Keita, we brought in Fabinho, Shaqiri, and a few months prior to that, brought in Van Dijk. So 2018, we saw the club spend a huge amount of money. Sure, we brought in a fair amount of money as well with sale of players, notably Coutinho, but there was a lot of money spent. Since then, we've not really been spending a great deal. And one of the things I noted on Twitter is that after 2018, in the 4 years since then, we've spent less money than Newcastle United have just in the calendar year 2022. So that just shows the levels of spend relative to not even rivals, but other clubs in the Premier League. Now, here's the thing. Yes, the wage bill has gone up significantly. If you go back only about 6 years, the wage bill was just over 200 million. And within a couple of years, it had increased to about 300 million. So 100 million plus increase in the wage bill in the space of a couple of years. And that was largely due to going from being a team that was finishing outside of the top four to becoming a Champions League top four team, and then becoming a Champions League winning team and a Premier League winning team. And by qualifying for the top four, the earnings of the players increased significantly. And obviously the fact we were achieving that was because we were winning more, scoring more, keeping more clean sheets. And all of these things come with bonuses as well. So go back 3 summers to the summer of 2019. At the start of that summer, just after we had won the Champions League, but come runners-up in the Premier League, John W. Henry made a comment about, he would back the club, and basically said that, we will spend as a club to go the extra and go on to win the Premier League. And yet our marquee signing that window was Sepp van der Berg. So, we clearly didn't spend much money at all in that window. And at that time, all of the Pat journalists were saying, look, the club's priority was to ensure that they retain the top players rather than to bring in new players. And, again, that created huge amounts of fume on Twitter and other social media. The fact that we appeared not to be strengthening the squad. We brought in Van der Berg, we brought in Adrian on a free, Andy Lonergan on a free, and young Harvey Elliott, who was, 15, 16 years of age at that point.
Now the marquee signing.
So, we weren't doing much business then. And, that was frustrating for fans, but the wage bill was pointed to. And, when the accounts were published a few months later, it showed that, the wage bill had increased very, very significantly. So it was a valid argument that, look, because our wage bill had increased so much, that was clearly curtailing the amount we can therefore spend on transfers. But as we now come into 21-22, the season just finished a few months back, the wage bill wasn't significantly up from 18-19. So my estimation is that we perhaps had a wage bill of 350 million, just slightly less than that. But our turnover was, I believe, 580 million, might be slightly more than that. And when I benchmarked the wages relative to turnover for Liverpool compared to Big Six rivals, it was pretty much on par with other clubs around us. So the point being, yes, our wage bill had increased significantly, yet other clubs still managed to spend significantly more on transfers than we do. So I accept the argument for 3 summers ago, when we spent very little. I struggle to accept that argument now, especially when you look at other clubs who have very significant wage bills and yet manage to find a way to still spend significant amounts in the transfer window. Now, there are other mitigating factors as well, but the wage bill, for me, is increasingly used as an excuse. And I think people need to look at the full context, and certainly look at by full context. It's saying look at other clubs as well before saying, look, we can't possibly afford to spend on transfers because most of the money's going on wages. You need to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, and about that bigger picture, maybe another, again, want for a better phrase, excuse is the investment in infrastructure. We've obviously seen the AXA training centre, that must have been a few years ago now, and obviously the stands, with the main stand and the Annie Road stand now. But you've mentioned this is a potential red herring on Twitter. I mean, why do you think that is?
Yeah, so again, that is one of the reasons given by some of our fan base about why we spend relatively little in the transfer window. When you look at net spend, for example, compared to our rivals, but we're spending on growing Anfield. We've spent on development of the AXA training centre. But here's the thing: so the main stand was funded by a loan. That loan was provided by FSG. It wasn't their money. It was money that they borrowed from funders. They then lent that money that they had borrowed onto Liverpool, but at no interest. So they incurred interest on their loan, but then they didn't pass any additional interest on when they were transferring that loan from them onto Liverpool. But that was a project that was delivered over 5 years ago. At the start of the 2016-17 season, the actual stand itself was largely open. There was some internal parts of that stand, such as changing rooms, which were completed over the subsequent months. And we had aimed as a club to reduce that debt of 110 million by about 20 to 22 million a year. The intention was to pay it off in 5 years. And between 2017 and 2021, we reduced it by, I think it was about £47 million. So that stand, though, certainly since 2021, hadn't received any further reductions. We hadn't paid any more off unless we did over the season just finished. And if we did, it might have been about another 20 million. The AXA Training Centre cost £56 million. That was delivered, I think it was in late 2020, if I'm not mistaken.
Sounds right.
So, certainly in the season just finished, 21-22, none of the £580 million would have had to go towards anything towards that training facility, because that was fully paid out of club generated revenue at the time. So we didn't take out any loans for that. And then we come to the Anfield Road end, where we did take out a significant loan in 2020, and we retained that through 2021, and I believe into 21-22 for the purposes of paying the expansion of the Annie Road end. So again, for the 580 million that I'm talking about, we shouldn't have had to use much or any of that for the Annie Road end redevelopment. That should have been covered by the loan. So the only thing that potentially the 580 million might have gone towards would have been reducing the loan for the main stand. Now, it might have been 20 million, might have been slightly more, but it would have been there or thereabouts. Now, if you look at Manchester United, for example, their levels of turnover were similar to ours, and they pay their owners dividends. So they take money out of the club, which our owners don't do. They don't receive a dividend coming out of Liverpool. And that dividend in most years is about 20 million.
Mm-hmm.
So, you see, for me, I think it is a red herring, because 21-22, the only thing that would have caused a bit of a drain on the 508 million in revenue should have been reducing the loan for the main stand. There would have been no expenses incurred for the AXA training facility, and should have been nothing or hardly anything in relation to the Annie Road end, because, as I say, that should have been covered by borrowing. So that's why I simply don't buy that as a reason or as an excuse for summer 22. Certainly in 2020, you could argue, yes, that was a factor because obviously we were delivering a £56 million facility in Kirby. But, since then, no, there shouldn't have been significant amounts of outlay. And again, when I talk about looking at it in the full context, look at Tottenham Hotspur. They built a £1 billion stadium, which opened 2 or 3 years ago. And, their loan for that stands at 850 million. And in the last couple of years, they've been outspending us. And no, they as a club and the owner, Joe Lewis, took the view, let's spread out this loan over a longer period. Whereas FSG's view is, if you take out borrowing to try and repay it as quickly as possible. So the more that you pay towards loans, the less money you then have to spend on other things such as transfers. So again, that's a judgment call. Some people may argue, well, look, why not spread out the loan over a longer payback period to then allow more funds to be used on things like transfers or wages or whatever else it might be? FSG take a slightly different view. And again, some people may think that's right, others may think that's wrong.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting in well, it doesn't, I don't think it really matters, does we just get no money either way. But yeah, that's an interesting one. But basically this comes down to what you've been discussing on Twitter threads recently more, and that's the club's finances. We obviously have the money. You mentioned our turnover similar to Man United's there, and albeit quite deservedly so, the Glazers are quite hated, but we saw their spend basically panic bought a few players in the last few weeks, and I'm not saying we should do stuff like that, obviously. But the ultimate question then is, Mo, where's the money? Where's the money going?
Yeah, it's a question that many people are asking. Look, the club publishes accounts for its financial year, which coincides with the season. So their financial year runs from the 1st of June to the 31st of May, which is pretty much in line with a typical season. The latest published set of accounts only relate to the 2020-21 season. So the latest set of accounts that are available relate to a season that finished some 15 plus months ago. And a lot has happened since then. So for the season that finished a few months back, 21-22, those accounts won't be available publicly until at least early March. So that's sort of disappointing because, people like me, people like Swiss Ramble and others left us somewhat speculate in terms of, well, how much money has come in. So I speculated it's about 508 million of turnover. And we've got to speculate about other things as well in order to try and explain why, for example, Liverpool are not spending. Now, I'm absolutely adamant that there is money available. And my view is, look, yes, we have spent just slightly more than the money that we brought in from sales of players like Sadio Mane. But what it means is that we will have much more cash in the bank as a result of that, which can then be used next summer. So, this is not a case of the money being siphoned by the owners to then pay for John W. Henry's latest yacht.
Yacht paint, let's go.
Or to go towards the Red Sox or their new what have they bought recently with Redbird?
The Pittsburgh Penguins, was it? And I think after a Vegas team or something as well.
Yeah. So I don't believe that there's any money being siphoned off for any of those kind of pursuits. It will just be a case, and I think the accounts will sort of reflect this. That there's just more money that's going into the bank because we haven't spent it. And as we discussed earlier, we had every intention of spending it on a player from Monaco, and then he changed his mind. So the money will sit there in the bank, and then come January transfer window or even the summer one, and we potentially will be able to use the money then. So the point being, we've generated a large surplus. I'm sure that the accounts will show that for 21-22, and the money just adds to available funds for next year. Now the club can, if they choose, and the owners can choose to reduce the main stand loan even more with that money, which for me would be a shame. I would prefer them to save that money for next year, because I think that we need to do a lot of business in the transfer window summer 23, when half our squad will be 60 years of age, but
and out of contract
as well. Yeah, so there will be a lot of business to do almost certainly next summer. We can't keep on going from summer to summer, only making slight additions to the overall squad. Whilst players are getting older and older, and they're going out of contract, and we know that we've got no fewer than 3 midfielders who will be out of contract next summer in Oxlade-Chamberlain, Naby, and James Milner. So, if all 3 go, and at least 2 of those 3 almost certainly will not be kept on, of the 3, James Milner somehow might find a way of remaining for yet another year.
He'll outlast Klopp. That's
we need somebody to shout at people. So he might stay. I think he'll go, but it's possible he might stay. But if he goes, that's 3 midfielders to replace. And on top of that, Bobby Firmino is out of contract. So he might have to be replaced if he goes, and I think he will. And on top of that, there were 1 or 2 players who might be coming towards the end of their peak, and then we might have to make a decision about whether we look to bring in people to challenge for their spots or even replace them. Andy Robertson has been, not the player he was in 17, 18, 19. In my view, he's not been that player for a good couple of years now. I mean, he has had spells where he's been strong, but he's been inconsistent. I think very few people can argue against that. And he is hitting 29 over the next 12 months. So, have we seen the best of him? And if we're working towards a more proactive kind of business model, is that the right time to move him on whilst he still has value and can still potentially go for 30-40 million pounds, and then bring in a strong replacement, or maybe move Tsimikas into that role instead? So there's a lot of decisions to be made, and almost certainly a lot of business to do. If we only make 2 permanent signings next summer, I dread to think what the state of the squad will be at that point. I think that, and I'm sure Jurgen Klopp, Julian Ward know all of this. They don't need people like me to spell it out for them. That they'll know it far better than I or anyone else on social media or podcasts will know about the situation. So they'll be fully aware, and they know that the kind of intensity, the dynamism that we expect of a Liverpool side when half your squad is 30 or older, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain that with that kind of age profile. So almost certainly we will have no option but to do business, even if Jurgen Klopp's natural inclinations might be to cling on to players. But I think his head will have to overrule his heart, and he'll reluctantly see some of those players move on.
Yeah, Jude Bellingham's clearly is not Jude Bellingham. Milner, maybe Henderson, is Moby Dick, his white whale. He has to fight them off before he can sign other players. But yeah, it should be interesting when we get the accounts in spring next year, as you say. Could answer a couple of these questions. But if we look outwards for the next few questions, I mean, obviously everyone's looked at our summer and went, well, what we've just discussed really. But probably the most interesting team to look at is probably Chelsea because, well, new owners. We don't have loads of information on them. Even Todd Bowley, I think he was the LA Dodgers and stuff like that. So not a huge amount of information, or certainly I've not seen loads of information on them. But they've spent 250 mil, a net of about 200 mil. Whereas when he first came into the club, apparently he was a fan of our model. This is not our model, Mo.
No.
Yeah, so obviously replacing Roman Abramovich, maybe he just wanted to make a splash, but how did they manage this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that they weren't even allowed to sell hot dogs in the stadium and stuff like that. They were worried about where even having to fly economy class on flights and stuff. They were in a real predicament. And when this new owner and his consortium came in, he was very much making noises to suggest that what he wanted to put in place was a more sustainable model, similar to that operated by FSG with Liverpool, and to an extent by the Cronkies at Arsenal. And yet, on the evidence of this transfer window, he's done the complete opposite. He spent money that he doesn't have. In terms of his wealth, I believe he alone is not even as wealthy as John W. Henry. I think that what has happened here is that he has actually managed to bring in very wealthy people into his consortium, because he hasn't come into this on his own, bear in mind. It's consortium headed by Todd Bowley. And one of the parties that are involved in this consortium is a group called Clearlake. Now, Clearlake has an investor that happens to be the investment fund operated by Saudi Arabia, of all people.
Oh, God. Not again.
Yes. So this is what I think has happened. I think that Clearlake and one part of Clearlake, being the Saudi Arabian PIF, have actually helped finance all of this. Now, that does open up a whole can of worms, because they are also involved in the ownership of Newcastle United. So I think the Premier League needs to perhaps take a close look at this, because it does go against various rules that ownership groups can't own more than one Premier League club, as far as I'm aware. And that's certainly problematic, when it comes to European competition. And that was part of the reason why RB Leipzig and Red Bull Salzburg had to make a bit of a distinction. I think RB Leipzig, who used to be known as Red Bull Leipzig, had to take on officially a slightly different ownership structure to differentiate themselves from Red Bull Salzburg. So I don't know if that will have to happen here in the same way, but it appears, and I could be wrong, but it appears that the roots of this money that Chelsea have managed to find to fund £250 million worth of deals, that those roots stem from Saudi Arabia. So that is not good news for those of us fans who were hoping that Chelsea's days of massive spending were over. If anything, it might appear that the spending will only ramp up. So that is cause for concern, especially when you look at as I noted, Newcastle United, who has its ownership firmly rooted in Saudi Arabia, have spent, as I noted earlier, very, very, very significant amounts of money, in the calendar year of 2022. So, when clubs like that continue to spend 200 million plus a year or a season, whilst we spend a lot less, how much longer does that remain sustainable for us in terms of being at the top table? And of course, it's not just about spending money. We've seen with Manchester United, you can spend more money than anyone and yet still be a complete and shambles of a club. If your transfer strategy is like playing darts blindfolded, then it will be very, very hit and miss, and more often than not a miss. And we've seen that with United over the last close to 10 years since Ferguson retired. So it's not all about money, but there generally is a trend between the amount of money you spend and success you have on the pitch. And so that is why I'm really hopeful that next summer will be the year where we do go big in the transfer market, because we have a squad that I don't think can carry on maintaining the levels it has achieved in the last 3 or 4 years for all that much longer.
Yeah, that's the thing. We used to be the smartest person in the room, and that can make up for it. But now you've got Chelsea, who I think are a bit Man United-ish this summer, but they don't have any footballing operations at the minute, so that could change. United don't really have football operations, so that should go on for a while. But yeah, eventually they will either learn or they will blind luck their way to success, and that's the worry, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, totally.
But we've mentioned Man United there. They've obviously, well, they almost didn't spend an awful lot, but in the last couple of weeks they went a bit mental. You've mentioned we have similar turnover, and I kind of alluded to it. We have like basically chalk and cheese ways of running the club. So how did they manage this? What was it? Was it 90 odd million or 80 odd million or 60 odd million? I think it was actually in Casemiro. The Anthony deal's funny, and the Martinez deal wasn't cheap either. So what have you? How did they manage this summer?
Right. So with Man United, complete basket case of a club, just so poorly run. It's like an example of how not to run a football club. But nonetheless, they somehow managed to attract, top players, and they, in the end, managed to attract 2 or 3. So Anthony was one that, a lot of our fans at various points over the last 2 or 3 months were getting slightly excited about, when there were 1 or 2 slightly less credible rumours coming out that maybe we were possibly in for him or were interested in him. But we would never, ever going to be spending the kind of money that Manchester United have. They are spending a guaranteed 95 million euros, which equates to about 80 million pounds, with 5 million worth of add-ons. And that's for a player that's probably worth about half as much.
If that.
Exactly, yeah. So, and that was clearly a signing driven by the manager. He'd worked with him at Ajax, and that was one of the clear flaws I feel in Manchester United's latest transfer window, in that they gave too much weight to what the manager wanted, rather. And we as a club at Liverpool operate in a slightly different way. Yes, the manager has a say in who we do eventually sign, but a lot of the groundwork is done by the kind of laptop geeks, so Julian Ward, Dr. Ian Graham, and his team of super geniuses, and they'll present the data, the vast amount of data and everything else to Klopp, and that usually works pretty well. Whereas in this window, anyone with any kind of association or link to Ajax seemed to be the preference for Erik ten Hag, and transfer people were dictated to a large extent by that. The only real exceptions were Casemiro and Malacia. So, yeah, I mean, they have generated, as you noted, similar levels of turnover to us for 21-22. Their accounts will be published much sooner than ours, so they should be out in the next 4 weeks. So we'll know exactly how much they generated. Their net spend was over 200 million, though. Their only real sale was Andres Pereira to Fulham for less than 10 million. There was a loan for Eric Bailly, who went out to Marseille, and that was it. So over 200 million net spend against us having a net spend of 6 million, despite virtually identical levels of turnover and their wage bill being probably 30 million, 40 million pounds more than ours. And on top of that, paying out dividends of 10 to 20 million to the Glazer family. So
must be paid out manager compensation as well still.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, manager compensation, which again would have been significant, 10, 15 million to Solskjaer and his coach and some of his coaches. So despite all of those costs that they've had and they've incurred, they still managed to find a couple hundred mil to spend on players. And, as we've noted, it's all in installments. So in real terms, that might have been anywhere from 70 million to maybe 100 million that they would have had to find.
Mm-hmm.
And, that is not money that comes from the owners. They, like FSG, do not put their own money into the club. So instead, what United would have done would have been to use club generate revenue plus cash that was in the bank. So they had a fair chunk of cash in bank. They took out a loan when was this? 2021 of £60 million. And I think that they utilised that to fund some of this transfer activity, along with club generated revenue from match day, TV money, commercial, etc. So they managed to find a way, is the point. And in the same way, if we wanted to spend end up with a couple hundred million transfer net spend, we could have found a way. But we operate in a more risk averse way, whereas the Glazers, despite not putting in their own money into United, are still a bit more open about how deals are financed and funded. Hence why they were able to fund deals to that extent.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting, especially now that, because the excuse used to be always they just printed money, whereas if we've caught up, it's going to be interesting how that comparison grows in the next couple of years. It's probably the wrong word, but we'll move on anyway. But it's not just about Man United and Chelsea. We do have other rivals. Let's go through some of these. Man City, I believe they made money in the transfer market, didn't they, this season? Obviously, the wage bill's a different story with whatever the hell Haaland's on, but they've had a un-Manchester City-like summer. That's probably how you'd word it.
Yeah, I mean, what they interestingly have started to do is try and copy the Chelsea model, because Chelsea's habit has been to sign a zillion players and loan most of them out.
Yeah.
But then when they've decided, right, it's time to move them on, they as a club have generated more from player sales than any other Premier League club over the last few years. And what Man City have tried to do is to try and replicate that in the last couple of seasons. So up until a couple of years ago, their net spend was very significant, whereas last summer or last season even, they sold about 85 million worth of players. And in this most recent summer, they've sold nearly £150 million worth of players. So Raheem, Sterling, Gabriel Jesus, Zinchenko, amongst the big sales. And as you noted, their sales actually exceeded the amount of outlay on transfer fees. So Haaland was obviously the biggest. Calvin Phillips from Leeds also was a significant fee. But some of their other deals were relatively small. So they ended up spending less than they actually brought in from sales. And, that they may well look to do the same next summer. So, we often hear about how, when our previous laptop geek, Michael Edwards, was at the club, the term, how Edwards had pulled off a masterstroke and a masterclass whenever he'd sell a player. But, if you look at, some of the fees that have been achieved by Man City and Chelsea, that they're even more impressive. And they certainly did really well to kind of generate the amount of money that they did. And had Barcelona been able to generate the funds, they would have bought even Bernardo Silva, and sales for Man City for this summer would have been in the region of about 220 to 230 million. Bernardo Silva would have gone for about 70 to 80 million to Barca had they been able to sort out their finances in time, which they weren't able to. And, the player was definitely disappointed, because I think it was only a couple of weeks ago, I remember him, waving goodbye to, the fans at the Etihad. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so he felt he was on his way, but clearly Barca just weren't able to make the numbers stack up. And so he remains for another season. I think almost inevitably he will go next summer. He's been wanting out from City for a couple of years now. So I think, he'll give him this final season and be on his way then. But yeah, very, very, very significant funds generated by them. And then just very quickly, Tottenham had another big kind of transfer window in terms of spend. So they spent over 150 million. They brought in about 35. So net spend was about 115. Their notable signings were Richarlison, is it? Is that how you pronounce his name?
I always go Charlison.
Charlison, yeah. My preferred title is Dickhead, but
yeah, absolutely right.
Christian Romero, Yves Bissouma, a couple of others. So, as I noted before, they've spent a huge amount of money on that amazing looking stadium, and yet, they've still gone out and spent this money. Now, the way they've done this is that they actually had £110 million come in from the owner. So the owner, Joe Lewis, who normally doesn't put any of his money into Tottenham Hotspur, took out a loan and then put it into the club as equity. And so he basically has increased his shareholding in the club as a result of that. And the reason he did that is because he and Daniel Levy both knew that were they not generating or making free funds to spend on the transfer window, Conte would have walked. He would have gone, because that's the kind of he is. So, and even by the end of this window, despite spending 150 plus million, the manager still wasn't happy. He was still moaning a little bit the other day. So, that's just Antonio Conte for you. But the point being, even Joe Lewis, the owner who's never put money into that club, found a way to put some money into Tottenham Hotspur in order to finance transfer deals. And then finally, Arsenal had yet another summer of big spend, a net spend of about 90, close to 100 million, notable signings being Gabriel Jesus, Fabio Vieira, Zinchenko, we talked about earlier on. But Arsenal fans were still fuming yesterday. They were saying, why didn't we sign another midfielder? Why didn't we sign one or two more players? They weren't happy. And nonetheless, they had a very big net spend. And, they had a very big net spend last summer as well. And that was about 120 million plus last summer. And that is despite the fact that their levels of turnover are way below ours. Their turnover for 21-22 would have been in the region of about £180 million less than ours. And yet they still outspent us significantly. Now, part of the reason for that is, as a club in the Arsene Wenger days, they did generate significant amounts of cash that was being put away in the bank. So at one point, they had literally 300 million sat in the bank. And even up until a couple of years ago, that was down to about 200 million. And they've been using that money in the last several years to finance all of these transfer dealings. So that's why, despite the lack of Champions League football, we've seen Arsenal spend a lot of money in transfer windows over the last few years in an effort to get back into the Champions League. It's the money that had been sat there in the bank under the Arsene days, who, as a manager, was almost treating it as his own money and was very reluctant to spend it. But they've been spending it now, and that money is almost all spent now. So I think unless they achieve significant sales next summer and they don't get Champions League football, it's almost impossible for them to be able to maintain another transfer window next summer where they can spend the amounts of money that they have in the last 2 or 3.
So Arsenal's going to be an interesting one to keep an eye on if the money has dried up, if they don't get Champions League. Fire sale at Arsenal? Saka to Liverpool? Who knows?
You never know.
Yeah, all of them will do. But that's it for what you've written up for me. Mo, is there anything else you want to discuss before we go?
I mean, I think that there's obviously some frustration. It's slightly muted frustration because we did manage to get a player in, and I just found it really funny that the club briefed all the local journalists about loan deal to say there's definitely no option to buy. So all the journalists at 10 o'clock last night put out there that, look, it's a loan deal but with no option to buy, only for minutes later Juventus to put out a press release. But bear in mind, Juventus are floated on the Italian stock exchange, so they've got to have a greater deal of financial transparency. Mm-hmm. Their press release, they contradicted Liverpool Football Club and said, actually, there is an option to buy, and that fee, if that is invoked, will be for the tune of 37 million euros, which equates to just over 30 million pounds. So it was not a good look for Liverpool to just lie. And
Very odd, wasn't it?
I didn't understand why they do that when they should know, even with a little bit of research, that for every deal Juventus are involved in, they have to release, and they do release, all the details about, transfer fees and other associated fees as well. So it was not a good look. I mean, it's not a major deal, but it just seemed like a needless thing to do, and it made some of these patch journalists look a bit stupid, and some of them did, in fairness, then retract their earliest tweets and statements to say, look, in fact, despite what we were told, it turns out there was an option to buy. And that might not be a bad thing, because if Arthur, or Artur, however you pronounce his name, turns out to be a really good signing and plays well for us this season, the option to buy, 30 million might be an absolute bargain come summer next year. So I'm glad that's in place, and it might help ease some of the business we need to do next summer, as we talked about, when we're going to have to recruit half a midfield squad pretty much.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And to be fair, we've seen in the past these options. Sometimes you can even get a cheaper deal. I think Barcelona, the option for Coutinho was like 35 mil, wasn't it? And I think Villa got him for about half that. So yeah, it's not as set in stone as probably once was. But I think we will finish up there then, Mo. Thank you for letting me host you. But thank you everyone for listening. When have you got another show planned, Mo? If I can get my words out there.
Not at this stage, but I would like to perhaps just focus in on perhaps the most craziest of all of the football clubs when it comes to football finance, and that's Barcelona. So if I can find a suitable guest to just really have a close look at that, then I'll try and make that happen in the coming weeks, before possibly during the upcoming international break.
Beautiful. I think everyone would be interested just to how the hell they bought all them players. But that'll certainly be interesting if we can get that show together. But thank you everyone for listening, as I said, and goodbye.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this Anfield Index show. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel so future podcasts find their way to your device automatically. There's nothing quite like fan engagement, and we'd love to know what you think of anything discussed on this show. The best way to get in touch is over on our free Discord community. where both podcasters and listeners debate the hottest LFC topics 24/7. Sign up free now at AnfieldIndex.com/Discord. You won't regret it. You can also follow us on Twitter at Anfield Index and find us on Facebook by searching for Anfield Index. Oh, and before you go, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it means the world to the people who create these free shows.